She didn't ask permission. Evelyn Harper dropped to her knees in the dirt beside that dying horse, pressed both hands flat against his swollen belly, and felt the heat radiating off him like a fever that had already decided to win. Her jaw was set. Her eyes didn't waver. Behind her, Nathan Calloway stood with a rifle aimed and a heart that had stopped believing in anything. If you've ever been told you don't belong, stay with me. Because this story is for you. Subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1874 came to Harlan Flats, Texas like a punishment. No mercy in it. No shade worth standing in. The kind of heat that cracked the earth open in long, crooked lines like the land itself was trying to confess something. Dust hung in the air all day and didn't settle until well past dark, and even then it clung to your skin, your lungs, your tongue. Evelyn Harper had lived through worse summers. Or so she told herself. She was 34 years old and had been a widow for 2 years. Thomas Harper had died of a chest sickness in the spring of 1872, leaving her the cabin at the edge of town, a garden nobody wanted, and a reputation she hadn't asked for. Root woman, they called her. Said it the way you'd say something unclean. She'd grown up learning plants from her mother, who'd learned them from her grandmother before that. A whole lineage of women who knew which bark brought down a fever, which root pulled the poison from a wound, which leaf pressed against a burn would stop the weeping. None of them had ever called it medicine. It was just what women did when there was no one else. In Harlan Flats, there was someone else now. Dr. Silas Mercer had arrived 3 years ago with a leather bag, a framed certificate, and an opinion on everything. He wore a pressed vest every single day, regardless of the heat, which Evelyn had always thought said something about a man. That kind of performance in the middle of a Texas summer meant he cared more about how he looked than about doing the actual work. She'd never said that out loud to anyone. She'd learned early that women who said true things out loud in small towns paid for it in ways that arrived quietly and stayed a long time. So she kept her garden. She kept to herself. She took what work came to her laundry preserves a midwife call now and then from women who didn't have money for the doctor or who'd been turned away from him with something dismissive and insufficient. She didn't seek trouble that July morning came looking for her anyway. It was Billy Turner who ran to her door. Billy was 19 years old cowhand out at the Calloway Ranch, all elbows and boots too big for him, the kind of young man who hadn't yet learned to be unkind. He came running through the heat with his hat in his hand, sweat cutting channels down his dusty face, and he didn't even knock. He hit the door with his open palm and called out before she'd had time to set down her coffee. Miss Evelyn, you gotta come." She opened the door and looked at him. "Storm's down," Billy said, breathing hard. "He's bloating up bad and he can't get his feet under him. Mr. Calloway's already got the rifle." She didn't ask questions. She turned back inside, moved to the row of jars on the shelf beside the window, and started pulling what she needed. "That horse worth saving?" she asked, her voice level. "He's the best horse in the county," Billy said. "Mr. Calloway would sooner die himself." "Then why is he standing there with a rifle instead of riding for help?" Billy looked at the floor. "There ain't anybody who knows horses like that. Doc Mercer don't touch animals. The ranch hand who used to know colics moved on last spring." He paused. "I thought of you, Miss Evelyn. I know Mr. Calloway didn't ask, but I didn't know what else to do." Evelyn looked at the boy for a moment. She could see the fear in him plain as anything. Not just fear for the horse. Fear of going back to that barn and watching something die when maybe there'd been a way to stop it. She recognized that feeling. She'd carried it herself. "Go back," she told him. "Tell him I'm coming. Don't let him pull that trigger before I get there." Billy's face flooded with something close to relief. "Yes, ma'am." He turned and ran. Evelyn walked. 3 miles between her cabin and the Calloway Ranch, and not a thread of shade along the road. The sun was already high and brutal. Dust puffed up around her boots with every step. She carried her cloth bag over one shoulder, her mother's bag, the one with the deep pockets and the worn leather strap, and she did not hurry more than she needed to. Hurrying in this heat would only wear her down before she arrived, and she needed to be steady when she got there. She knew what she was walking into. Nathan Calloway's name was spoken with a particular weight in Harlan Flats. He'd built that ranch from nothing. Lost his wife Margaret to the scarlet fever 5 years back, and his infant daughter 3 days after that. People said the grief had sealed something shut in him, that he'd come out the other side of it harder, quieter, and entirely done with sentiment. He ran a clean operation, paid fair wages, kept to himself outside of business. Nobody disliked him exactly, but nobody claimed to know him either. He was not a man the town understood who had patience for things he couldn't explain. Evelyn was one of those things. She'd been brought to the Calloway Ranch exactly once before, 2 years ago, before Thomas died, to tend to a cowhand's infected hand. She'd cleaned it, packed it with a poultice, and told the man to keep it dry for a week. He'd kept the hand. Nathan Calloway had watched the whole thing from the doorway of the barn without a word. And when she'd turned to leave, he hadn't offered thanks or payment. He'd only said quietly, "How much?" and pressed the coins into her palm without looking at her directly. She hadn't expected warmth. She hadn't gotten any. That was the sum total of their history. And now she was walking 3 miles in July heat to tell him not to shoot his horse. She heard the barn before she saw it. The sounds a horse makes when it's suffering carry a particular quality not quite like pain in a person. Something older and more helpless than that. A deep, irregular groan that came and went. The dull, desperate impact of hooves against the ground. The voices of men low and tight with an uncertainty they were trying not to show. Evelyn came through the barn door without announcing herself. There were 4 of them inside. 2 ranch hands she recognized by face but not name, pressed back against the far wall. Billy Turner, standing close to the horse's head, with his hat twisted in both hands. And Nathan Calloway, standing with the rifle hanging loose at his side, looking at the animal on the ground, with an expression that had gone past grief into something emptier. Storm was a black stallion, 16 hands at least, and he was down on his side with his belly distended in a way that made the danger plain even to a casual eye. His legs moved in weak, uncoordinated attempts at rising that he couldn't complete. His breathing was shallow and fast. His eyes showed white around the edges. Nathan heard her come in. He turned his head, and when he saw her, something moved behind his eyes. Irritation maybe, or surprise, or some calculation she couldn't read. "Miss Harper," he said, and his voice was flat. "Mr. Calloway." She looked past him to the horse. "How long has he been down?" "Hour, maybe more." He didn't move from where he was standing. "Billy shouldn't have brought you here." "Probably not," she agreed. "Move back from him." Nathan's jaw tightened. "I don't think you understand the situation." "I understand it fine." She was already moving toward the horse, setting her bag down, crouching to put her hands on the animal's belly, with the same flat-palmed assessment she'd been making since she'd walked through the door. "He's got a gas colic. The pressure's built up, and he can't move it through. The longer he stays down, the more he risks twisting the gut, and if that happens, there's no coming back from it." She kept her eyes on the horse. "So you can shoot him right now and be done with it, or you can give me 20 minutes. Silence in the barn. 20 minutes, Nathan said slowly. "And if it doesn't work?" "Then you'll still have the rifle," she said. "Nothing's changed except 20 minutes. The 2 ranch hands against the wall exchanged a look. Billy Turner didn't look at anyone. He just breathed. Nathan Calloway said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the rifle in his hand. He looked at the horse. He looked at Evelyn Harper, kneeling in the dirt without any apparent concern for what he thought about any of it. 20 minutes, he said finally. She worked quietly and without performance. From her bag, she drew a length of rubber tubing, a small glass bottle, a packet of dried herb wild ginger root, and something the men probably couldn't name, and a tin of rendered lard she used to coat the tube. She explained nothing unprompted. When Billy asked what she was doing, she said, "Helping the gas find a way out," in a tone that invited no further questions. Nathan stood back and watched. He didn't interfere. He didn't offer help, but he didn't leave either. The first ranch hand, the older one thick-shouldered with a face like weathered saddle leather, said under his breath, but not quietly enough, "This is foolishness." Evelyn didn't look up. "You're welcome to step outside." He stayed. She worked the tube in carefully, one hand steady on Storm's flank, talking to the horse in a low, continuous murmur that wasn't quite words, more like sound, like the kind of sound you made to remind something living that it wasn't alone. The horse's breathing remained ragged and fast. His legs trembled. Nathan watched her hands. They were sure. Whatever he might think of her, he could see that much. There was no hesitation in them, no second guessing. These were hands that had done this kind of work before, or something enough like it. He'd spent enough time around people who knew what they were doing to recognize that quality, the specific stillness of competence. He didn't say anything, but he moved without quite deciding to 2 steps closer. Then the sound came, a long, resonant release of gas, ugly and unmistakable, and in that moment, the finest sound Evelyn Harper had heard in recent memory. Storm's belly shifted. The terrible tightness that had been visible across the drum of his flank began slowly to ease. The horse's breathing changed, deepened. His legs stopped their desperate scrambling and went quiet. A minute passed. Another. Storm made a sound, not pain, not distress. Something lower than that. The sound of discomfort giving way. Then, with the slow, tremendous effort of a large animal refusing to quit, he got his front legs under him, pushed, swayed, got his back end up. He was standing, not steadily, but standing. The older ranch hand made a sound in his throat that he quickly converted into a cough. Billy Turner let out a breath that had apparently been held for approximately 5 minutes. Evelyn sat back on her heels, her hands resting on her thighs, and she let herself feel for just a moment the quiet satisfaction of a thing done right. She looked up. Nathan Calloway was staring at the horse. His jaw was set the way it always seemed to be set, but there was something in his face that hadn't been there before, a crack in that sealed-off expression, something raw and unguarded showing through at the edges. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than she'd heard it. "What do I owe you?" he said. Not a question. The same way he'd said it 2 years ago. Evelyn stood, brushed the dirt from her skirt, and started returning her things to the bag. "Keep him standing for the next hour," she said. "Walk him slow. Don't let him eat until tomorrow morning, just water. If he goes down again, send for me." "What do I owe you?" Nathan said again. She looked at him then, directly, the way she didn't always allow herself to look at people who had the power to make her life harder. "Nothing," she said. "Just don't let Billy take the blame for calling me." She picked up her bag and walked out of the barn into the blazing July afternoon. She was back on the road before the shaking started in her hands. She let it happen. 3 miles of heat and road waited ahead of her, and she hadn't eaten since before Billy came to her door, and her knees were already complaining about the time she'd spent kneeling in that barn. It was all right. She'd been more tired. She'd walked farther on worse days. What she hadn't expected, what she was still trying to name as she walked, was the look on Nathan Calloway's face when Storm stood up. She'd seen men cry at moments like that before. Had seen them turn away and cough and swear and pretend nothing had happened. Nathan hadn't done any of that. He'd just stood there completely still with something undisguised in his expression for the space of 3 or 4 seconds before he'd reassembled himself. Something that looked almost like the way a man looks when he's been saved from doing something he couldn't have come back from. She didn't let herself think about it too long. It wasn't her business what Nathan Calloway felt. She'd gone out there for the horse because Billy had asked, because she'd spent her whole life answering that kind of ask from people who had nowhere else to turn. That was all. But the road back to town felt different than the road out. She couldn't have said exactly why. Dr. Silas Mercer was standing outside the general store when she walked back through town. He saw her. She saw him see her. He took in the dirt on her skirt, the bag on her shoulder, the direction she'd come from. "Miss Harper," he said with the particular smile that wasn't really a smile. "You look like you've been busy." "Afternoon, doctor," she said and kept walking. "I heard young Turner went out to the Harper cabin this morning," Mercer said, falling into step beside her in a way she hadn't invited. "I heard it had something to do with Calloway's stallion." She didn't answer. "You know?" Mercer said, his voice staying pleasant. "There are liability considerations when untrained individuals involve themselves in animal care, and by extension in the care of anything else in this community." He paused. "It's not a threat, Miss Harper. It's just a fact. People get nervous when they don't understand where the lines are." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him. "Storm is standing up," she said. She walked the rest of the way home, alone. That evening, Nathan Calloway stood in the barn long after the hands had gone to supper. Storm was quieter now, standing eating a little hay, despite instructions Nathan had made an executive decision about that reasoning, that the horse knew his own body and had earned the right to make that particular call. He stood beside the stallion with one hand on the animal's neck, not petting exactly, just present. "You'd have been gone," he said quietly, "if I'd done what I was about to do." Storm didn't respond to this being a horse. "She walked 3 miles, Nathan said. "In that heat. Nobody asked her to. Nobody's asking her much of anything, I expect, and she just—" He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. It wasn't a kind of thought he was used to finishing. He'd lost Margaret in the barn, not unlike this one. The fever having taken her so fast, there'd been no time to prepare for it, no time to do anything but stand there, while the thing he'd built his life around dissolved. He'd stood exactly like this afterward, hand on the neck of one horse or another, talking to something that couldn't talk back because it was the only form of conversation he could manage. He hadn't trusted anything he couldn't see clearly since then. Hadn't let himself. You let the invisible things in hope, belief, whatever it was, a woman like Evelyn Harper was trading in, and they became the knife. He'd learned that in the worst way a man could learn anything. But Storm was standing. And the woman who'd made that happen had walked back into town without asking for a thing, except that a boy not be blamed for acting out of kindness. Nathan took his hand off the horse's neck. He went inside. But it was a long time before he slept. Across town in the cabin at the edge of things, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table in the dark. She didn't light the lamp. The heat hadn't gone anywhere with the sun, and somehow the dark felt cooler, or at least it felt like something she chose. She thought about what Mercer had said. She thought about the way he'd smiled. She knew what that kind of smile meant. She'd watched her mother navigate it, and her mother's mother before that. Women who knew things the credentialed men didn't know were a particular kind of problem for a particular kind of man. They took up space that felt to him like rightfully his. They didn't need permission the way they were supposed to need it. She wasn't afraid of Silas Mercer, but she was tired. She pressed her hands flat on the table, looked at them in the dark hands that smelled still of ginger root and horse and the long road, and she thought about the fact that Nathan Calloway had watched her save something he'd loved and had not at any point said thank you. He'd said, "What do I owe you?" twice, which was a kind of acknowledgement, she supposed, the only kind some men knew how to give. She thought about the 3 or 4 seconds when his face had been open like that. Undefended. Don't, she told herself firmly. Don't make a thing of that. She went to bed. Outside, the summer night pressed down on Harlan Flats like a hand, and the heat didn't break, and the stars didn't care about any of it. Not about Storm standing in his stall. Not about Silas Mercer and his smile. Not about a widow who had walked 3 miles and asked for nothing, and was trying very hard in the dark not to wonder if it had meant something to a man who didn't let things mean anything anymore. 3 days passed before Nathan Calloway did anything about it. That was how long it took him to talk himself out of going, talk himself back into it, and finally saddle a horse on a Wednesday morning and ride into town without telling anyone where he was headed or why. He told himself it was a business matter, a reasonable transaction. A man settled his debts, that was all this was. He found her in the garden behind the cabin on her knees in the dirt, working around the base of something low and sprawling that he couldn't name. She didn't hear him coming, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. He tied the horse at the post by the road and walked around the side of the cabin and stood there for a moment, watching her hands move through the soil with that same settled efficiency he'd noticed in the barn. "Miss Harper," he said. She looked up without startling, as though she'd expected exactly this, or at least had decided to behave as though she had. "Mr. Calloway." She sat back on her heels and looked at him, shading her eyes against the morning glare. "Storm all right?" "Storm is fine." He cleared his throat. "Better than fine, actually. He ate this morning like nothing happened." "Good," she said simply, and started to turn back to her work. "I owe you something," he said. She paused but didn't look back up. "I told you I didn't want anything. What you want and what's right aren't always the same thing." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. Not money, which surprised her enough that she took it when he extended it. She unfolded it. It was a letter, brief and plainly written in his hand, stating that Evelyn Harper had rendered necessary and skilled care to the Calloway Ranch on the 15th of July, and that any man who said otherwise could take the matter up with Nathan Calloway directly. She stared at it for a moment. "That's not payment," she said. "No," he agreed. "But around here it might be worth more." She looked up at him, then trying to read the expression under the flat reserve. She couldn't. He was already putting his hat back on, already half-turned toward his horse. "Mr. Calloway," she said. He stopped. "Mercer's going to cause problems," she said. "For me. The letter helps, but it won't stop him." Something shifted in Nathan's jaw. "What kind of problems?" "The kind that don't show fingerprints," she said. "He'll talk. He already started." She folded the letter carefully and stood brushing the dirt from her hands. "I'm not telling you this, so you'll do something about it. I'm telling you because you seem like a man who doesn't like surprises, and you should know what you've put your name to." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know what I've put my name to," he said. He rode back to the ranch without another word, but he didn't ride toward Mercer's office the way part of him wanted to, because he didn't yet trust what he'd say when he got there. That was progress of sorts. Evelyn folded the letter into her apron pocket and went back to her garden. Her hands were steady. She made sure of that. The heat that day was merciless, the same as every other day that July. The sun sitting flat and heavy over Harlan Flats like it had decided to stay. She worked until the light forced her back inside, and she didn't think about Nathan Calloway's handwriting or the fact that he'd come to her without being asked. She thought about it a little. She was human. The letter found its way to 3 people before the week was out, not because Evelyn showed it around, she didn't, but because Billy Turner had seen Nathan ride out toward the Harper cabin that Wednesday morning and had mentioned it to the other hands with the involuntary enthusiasm of a young man who wanted very much for something good to happen in the world. From the ranch hands, it moved as things did in small towns, through the natural channels of human curiosity. And by Friday evening, most of Harlan Flats knew that Nathan Calloway had backed the root woman with his name. Opinions on this divided along predictable lines. The women who'd used Evelyn's remedies quietly privately when there was no other option felt something they didn't quite let themselves call relief. The men who deferred to Dr. Mercer on principle felt something they didn't quite let themselves call unease. And Silas Mercer himself, who heard about it on Thursday over breakfast at the boarding house, set down his coffee cup very carefully and spent the next 3 hours paying social calls around town with the pleasant, tireless efficiency of a man ensuring a particular story got told correctly. The story he told went like this. A grieving man not thinking clearly had momentarily credited an untrained woman with a lucky outcome. It was understandable. Loss did things to a man's judgment. But the town ought not read too much into it. There were proper channels for a reason. There was training for a reason. What happened in that barn could have gone badly, would have gone badly in his professional opinion, and the only reason Nathan Calloway still had his stallion was chance, plain and simple. Chance and the mercy of a constitution stronger than the intervention. He said all of this in a warm, concerned voice with his hand sometimes briefly on a shoulder. And by Friday evening, the town's opinion had been very efficiently redistributed. The women who'd bought herbs from Evelyn still had their jars, But they didn't say so out loud at the market on Saturday morning. Evelyn noticed. She had long practiced noticing things like this, the way a conversation dried up when she walked in, the way eye contact became suddenly difficult. She bought her flour and her salt, and she walked home, and she didn't let her face do anything on the street that could be used against her. Inside the cabin, she sat down at the table and put her head in her hands for 30 seconds. Then she got up and went back to work. That was the only answer she'd ever found to any of it. The garden didn't care what Mercer said. The plants didn't have opinions about her credentials. The work was just the work, and it wanted doing, and she could do it. She pulled out her mother's journal, a battered thing half the pages loose. Her mother's handwriting, cramped and dense and practical, and she found the section on colic treatments and read through it twice, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she needed to remember who she came from. The women who'd built this knowledge hadn't asked for permission. They'd just known things, and they'd shared them, and they'd kept going. She put the journal away. She went outside and picked 6 inches of root she'd been letting mature for 3 weeks, washed it, dried it, packed it in muslin. 2 days later, a knock came at her door at 6:30 in the morning. She opened it expecting Billy Turner again. It wasn't Billy Turner. It was Ada Walsh, a rancher's wife from the north end of the county. A woman Evelyn knew by sight, and not much more square-shouldered practical in her 50s, the kind of woman who'd survived enough to have stopped apologizing for anything. "I need something for fever," Ada said without preamble. "My youngest hand. 3 days in, and it's not breaking." "Come in," Evelyn said. Ada came in. She looked around the cabin with the appraising look of someone who'd heard things and was now checking them against reality. Then she looked at Evelyn. "Mercer says the fever's going around, and everyone should stay away from creek water," Ada said. "He gave Tom a bottle of his tonic. $3. Tom's not better." Evelyn went to her shelf. "How high is the fever?" 103 last I checked him." Evelyn took down 2 jars and a wrapped bundle. "Willow bark for the fever, elderflower to help him sweat it out the right way. Yarrow in the bundle, make a tea, half a cup every 2 hours, keep him covered. Keep him drinking water." She paused. "Not creek water. Mercer's right about that part at least." Ada looked at the herbs in her hands. "How much?" 50 cents, Evelyn said. "If it doesn't help within a day, come back." Ada put the coins on the table and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was not quite warmth, but was something in that direction, a recognizing maybe one capable woman to another. "I heard Nathan Calloway wrote you a letter," Ada said. "He did." "Good," Ada said, and left. Evelyn stood at the open door and watched her ride out. Something had moved in her chest, not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that was trying to be careful. She'd been trying to be careful for a long time. 2 hours later, she was cutting root by the back window when she heard the sound of a horse coming fast down the road toward the cabin. Fast enough to make her look up. Fast enough to pull her to the door. It was Billy Turner again, but this time without the desperate sprint, this time on horseback, which meant this time it was worse. "Miss Evelyn," he said, pulling up hard, his face carrying that same combination of urgency and apology she'd come to recognize as his particular calling card. "Mr. Calloway needs to see you. It's not Storm this time." She stepped outside. "What is it?" Billy hesitated, pressed his lips together. "It's Donovan. One of our hands. He's bad." Her hand tightened on the doorframe. "What kind of bad?" "Cut his hand on a piece of wire 2 weeks ago," Billy said. "He didn't say anything about it, and now it's Miss Evelyn. His hand is red up to the elbow, and he's got a fever, and Mr. Calloway rode for Mercer this morning, and Mercer said—" He stopped. "What did Mercer say?" Billy met her eyes with something uncomfortable in his. "He said there wasn't much to be done. He said the infection was too far along, and a man in his right mind would prepare himself for an amputation at minimum." A beat. "He also said that if anyone got it into their head to try alternatives, he'd be filing a complaint with the county." Evelyn felt something go cold and clear in the center of her chest. "He said that," she said. "Yes, ma'am. While Donovan is lying there with his arm going bad, Billy's jaw moved. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She was back inside for 30 seconds. She came out with her bag bigger this time and locked the cabin door behind her. "Give me a hand up," she said, and Billy reached down from the saddle and she put her foot on his boot and swung up behind him, and he turned the horse toward the Callaway Ranch without either of them saying another word. The ride was 4 minutes at a gallop that she spent thinking through what she knew and what she had and what she'd need. The hot wind pressing against her face, her mind running ahead of her, the way it always did before something difficult. She'd seen infections like that described in her mother's journal. She'd tended smaller ones. She'd never faced one this far along. She was afraid. She chose to be afraid quietly in the back of her mind, where it could wait. They came through the ranch gate at a pace that brought 2 hands out of the barn to look, and she slid down from the horse before it had fully stopped and followed Billy around to the bunkhouse where the other men were gathered with the specific, aimless worry of people who didn't know what to do with their hands. She heard Nathan before she saw him. "I said clear the door." His voice came low and sharp. "Give the man some room to breathe." The hands parted. She walked through. Donovan was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with gray at his temples and the look of someone who had spent decades being too stubborn to admit to weakness. He was lying on his bunk, his face the wrong color, too much red and too little of anything else, and his right arm was wrapped in a cloth that hadn't been changed recently enough. She could smell the infection from 4 feet away. Nathan was standing at the end of the bed. He saw her come through the door, and something moved across his face, relief and reluctance in the same breath. "Miss Harper," he said. "Move," she said. He moved, which she would think later said more about the state he was in than anything else could have. She crouched beside the bunk and took Donovan's arm gently in both hands. He hissed in a breath. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm going to be as quick as I can." She began to unwrap the cloth. Slowly, steadily. The hand and forearm that emerged made one of the younger hands turn and go quickly outside. Evelyn didn't flinch. She had flinched internally before she arrived, and she'd finished with that. "How long since the wound started looking like this?" she asked Donovan directly. 4 days, he said, his voice hoarse. "Maybe 5. "The red line," she said, tracing the air above the inside of his arm without touching it. "Did you watch it move?" "Didn't want to look at it," he admitted. "Donovan," she said, and her voice was not unkind, just straight. "Did anyone look at this before today?" A silence. "He told me it would work itself out," Donovan said. She didn't ask who he was. She already knew. She looked up at Nathan, who was standing 3 feet behind her, with his arms crossed and his face carefully arranged. "I need boiled water," she said. "Clean cloth, hot as you can stand to handle. And someone needs to send to my cabin the keys on the nail above the door, left shelf 3rd jar from the right, the one with the red mark on the lid, and the tall green bottle beside it." Nathan was already looking at Billy. Billy was already gone. Evelyn rolled up her sleeves. "What are you going to do?" Nathan asked. "Draw the infection out," she said. "Open the wound drain. What's in there, pack it with a drawing poultice and get the fever down." She looked at Donovan. "It's going to hurt." Donovan closed his eyes. "Worse than this." "At first," she said honestly. "All right," he said. "Do it." She worked for the better part of 2 hours. Nathan stayed. She hadn't asked him to, and she didn't look at him while she worked, but she was aware of him behind her. The same way you're aware of something you've decided not to think about through the periphery, through small sounds, through an absence of the particular kind of interference that most people couldn't resist offering. He brought her the boiled water himself when it was ready. He held it without being asked when she needed both hands free. He said nothing at all for the full 2 hours, which she was more grateful for than she would have said out loud. Donovan cursed once violently and then apologized immediately in her direction. "No need," she said, and kept working. When she was done, the wound cleaned, drained, packed with the poultice she'd made from the jar, with the red mark. Donovan's arm wrapped clean and proper, the fever still high, but his color already less alarming. She sat back on her heels and let her shoulders drop. "Every 4 hours change the cloth," she said. "Keep it warm. Get him to drink. The fever should come down by morning. If the red line moves past the elbow—" She paused. Chose honesty. "Send for me immediately." She stood. Her back ached. Her hands were trembling slightly, which she kept against her sides. Nathan followed her out of the bunkhouse into the brutal afternoon light. She started walking toward the gate without thinking about it, and he fell into step beside her, which she hadn't expected. "Miss Harper," he said. She kept walking. "You don't have to say it." "I'd like to," he said. She stopped. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that same direct quality she'd noticed the first time, nothing performing about it, no social courtesy layered over the top. Just the fact of his looking. "Thank you," he said, "for coming, for both times." A pause. "Mercer." "I know what Mercer said," she said. "It doesn't change what I was going to do." "No," Nathan said quietly. "I didn't think it would." He looked down at his hat for a moment. "He filed something with the county this afternoon, before you got here. I don't know yet what it amounts to." Evelyn felt the cold, clear thing again in the center of her chest, but kept her face where it was. "Then I suppose we'll find out," she said. "I suppose we will," Nathan said. And then, with a careful quality that she recognized as a man operating outside his practiced habits, "I'll see you home." She looked at him. "It's 3 miles, she said. "I walked it before." "I know you did," he said. "I'd like to ride it with you this time, if that's agreeable." It was not the most eloquent thing she'd ever heard. But it was real the way things are real when they cost something, and Evelyn Harper, who had learned to distinguish between the two, felt it register somewhere under her breastbone and stay there. "That's agreeable," she said. They got the horses. They rode the 3 miles mostly in silence, the afternoon heat pressing down the dust rising in small clouds from the horses' feet, the scrub on either side of the road casting no shade worth mentioning. Halfway to town, Nathan said without looking at her, "Storm ran the fence line this morning. First time in weeks." "Good sign," she said. "Yes," he said. And that was the whole of it, that particular conversation. But it sat between them on the road, the way comfortable things do, not filling the silence so much as giving it a shape they could both live inside. At the edge of town he stopped because going further meant people would see, and both of them understood the various complications of that without either of them saying so. "I'll be at the county office tomorrow morning," he said, "when they open, to find out what Mercer filed and what can be done about it." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I put my name to you," he said, plainly. As if that were the whole explanation, and it was. She looked at him for a moment in the long, angled light of the late afternoon. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Nathan," he said. She considered that. "Nathan," she said. "Be careful with Mercer. He's not going to stop." "Neither am I," Nathan said, and turned his horse back toward the ranch. She rode the last half-mile into town. Alone, returned the borrowed horse to Billy, who materialized out of nowhere to take it with his characteristic anxious helpfulness, and walked the last 100 yards to her cabin on her own feet. Inside, she lit the lamp. She made tea. She sat at the table and drank it in the quiet of the evening, and thought about Donovan's arm, and the red line that had stopped moving before she'd gotten to it, and she thought about the letter still in her apron pocket, and she thought about the sound of Nathan Calloway's voice saying, "Neither am I," with that flat, assured, entirely unremarkable certainty of his. She was afraid of Silas Mercer. She knew what men like him could do. She was also, for the first time in some while, not afraid of being afraid. That was new. She wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. Outside, the summer dark fell over Harlan Flats, and the heat sat in the air like something that intended to stay, and 3 miles up the road in the barn, where a black stallion paced his stall with the easy energy of an animal restored to himself. Nathan Calloway stood in the lamplight and read through every piece of paper he owned that had the county's letterhead on it. He was looking for leverage. He had the expression of a man who intended to find some. Across town in the back office of a white-painted building with a polished sign on the door. Dr. Silas Mercer was writing a second letter. Longer this time, more formal, to a man in the county seat, whose name Nathan Calloway would not have recognized, but whose signature could make things in Harlan Flats very difficult for a woman who practiced medicine without a certificate. He sealed the envelope with the satisfaction of a man who had done this before and knew how it ended. He didn't know about Ada Walsh, who had gone home that morning and brewed the elderflower tea and given it to her hand, Tom, every 2 hours, without fail, and who had sat beside him at midnight when his fever broke properly for the first time, sweating clean and sleeping easy for the first time in days. He didn't know that Tom Walsh had said, coming out of the worst of it, "Who gave you that tea?" and that Ada had said the name quietly, and that Tom had nodded once and said, "Tell her thank you," and that Ada had written it down on a piece of paper she intended to present somewhere eventually to someone at the right time. He didn't know any of that. He blew out his lamp and went to bed satisfied. That was his first real mistake. Tom Walsh was back on his feet by Saturday. Ada hadn't planned to make a thing of it. She was a practical woman who did not generally traffic in announcements or demonstrations. But when she rode into Harlan Flats that Saturday morning to pick up feed and salt, and saw Dr. Silas Mercer standing outside the general store talking to 2 men from the town council with that particular posture of his chest-forward chin lifted the posture of a man laying down the law, something in her decided that practical had its limits. She tied her horse. She walked over. She waited for a pause in the conversation, and when it came she said clearly and without apology, "Tom's fever broke Thursday night. He's eating this morning. Evelyn Harper's remedies did what $3 of your tonic didn't, Silas." The 2 councilmen looked at Mercer. Mercer's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "Mrs. Walsh," he said warmly, "I'm glad Tom is recovering. Bodies do that sometimes, given rest and time." "It wasn't rest and time," Ada said. "It was willow bark and elderflower tea, and a woman who knew what she was doing." She nodded to the councilmen not unkindly. "Morning, gentlemen." And she walked into the general store. She heard Mercer resume talking behind her, his voice recalibrating smoothly, and she bought her feed and her salt, and she didn't look back. That exchange lasted 45 seconds. By noon, it had been repeated in various forms across 6 conversations in Harlan Flats. By mid-afternoon, the shape of the story in town had shifted, not reversed, not by a long measure, but shifted the way a room shifts when someone opens a window and the air moves through it for the first time in weeks. Evelyn didn't know any of this when she opened her door on Saturday afternoon to find Nathan Calloway standing on her step. He wasn't on horseback this time. He'd walked from where he'd tied the horse up at the edge of the road, which meant he'd wanted the approach to be quiet, or at least thoughtful. She noticed that. She noticed most things. "You went to the county office," she said. "I did." He took his hat off and held it. That was new, the hat holding. "The complaint Mercer filed is real, but it's thin. It's a formal objection to the practice of medicine without a license. The county clerk told me that for it to go anywhere, he'd need a seconding complaint from another property owner, or a formal petition with signatures." He paused. "He's getting signatures." Evelyn leaned against the doorframe. "How many?" "7 so far, mostly men who owe him favors or money." His jaw tightened. "It takes 15 for the petition to require a county response. And if it gets 15, they send an investigator from the county seat. Could take weeks, could take longer." He met her eyes. "In the meantime, he can push to have you informally barred from treating people. It wouldn't be legal exactly, but in a town this size, legal and practical aren't always the same." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I want to counter it," Nathan said. "A counter petition. Names of people you've helped who are willing to say so." He paused, and she could see the thing. It cost him not the action itself, but the asking, which was a different kind of exposure for a man like him. "I'd need you to tell me who." She looked at him. Some of them won't want their names on paper. They came to me because they didn't want anyone to know. I understand that. Do you? She kept her voice even. A woman who buys herbs from the root woman doesn't always want her husband to know she doesn't trust the doctor he paid for. There are reasons people keep things quiet that don't have anything to do with cowardice. Nathan absorbed that. He didn't argue it. Then names who are willing, he said. However many that is, it's a start. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. He came inside. He'd never been inside the cabin before. She watched him take it in without being obvious about it. The shelves of jars and bundles, her mother's journal on the table, the garden visible through the back window, the general order of a small space organized by someone who knew exactly what she had and where it was. He didn't comment on any of it. But he looked and she let him. She made coffee. She sat across from him, and they went through the names she could offer, and she was careful about it, and he was careful about it too, asking the right questions and not pushing at the edges of the ones she didn't answer. It took an hour. They came up with 9 names she thought might agree, including Ada Walsh and Nathan, added 2 ranch hands of his own who'd been treated for minor things and had no reason to hide it. 11 names possible. They needed more. Billy, Nathan said. Billy's 19, Evelyn said. Billy's also employed on the largest ranch in the county, and his employer's name is already on the letter, Nathan said. That counts for something. She almost smiled. All right, Billy. 12. They sat with the list between them and drank the coffee she'd made and didn't talk for a minute. Outside the window, her garden ran in its patient rows, and the afternoon heat sat over everything, and the town of Harlan Flats was 3 miles away, doing whatever it was doing with the story of their lives. He won't stop at the petition, Evelyn said finally. Even if we match it. You know that. Yes, Nathan said. He's going to make this personal, she said. He's already making it personal. It won't just be about my remedies. He'll find something else to use. Nathan looked at her. What do you mean? She looked at her coffee cup. I mean that a man in his position has 2 choices when his authority is challenged by a woman. He can ignore her, or he can destroy her reputation entirely. He can't ignore me anymore, not after Storm, not after Donovan. She looked up. So it'll be my reputation, what I am, what I've done, who I've spent time with. She held his gaze steadily. Including this. The silence that followed had weight. Nathan set his cup down. He understood exactly what she meant, and she could see him understanding it the way his jaw shifted, the way his eyes moved, and then came back to her face with a decision already made in them that she hadn't seen forming. I'm not going to pretend I was never here, he said. I'm not asking you to, she said quietly. I'm asking you to understand what you're walking into. You don't have to walk into it. Evelyn, he said. Her name just like that, flat and simple, and for the first time without the miss in front of it. She felt it land somewhere specific. I watched that man stand outside your door and threaten you while my ranch hand was burning up with infection. I'm not walking away from that. She didn't say anything. I'll have the counter petition started by Monday, he said. I'll get Donovan to sign it himself if he can hold a pen. He can, she said. I checked the arm yesterday. He can hold a pen. Nathan nodded once. He stood, picked up his hat. He looked at her for a moment with that direct quality that she'd stopped trying to interpret and had started simply receiving. Lock your door at night, he said. I always lock my door at night, she said. Lock it better. And then he was gone, and she was left in the quiet of the cabin with 12 names on a piece of paper and a feeling in her chest that she was working hard not to call anything. Because the last time she'd called that feeling something, she'd built a life around it, and then watched it get taken away in a spring that felt nothing like spring, and she was not. She told herself firmly going to be that kind of fool twice. She locked the door, both bolts. On Monday morning, Nathan Calloway walked into the county clerk's office at 7:59 and was the first person through the door when it opened at 8. He set the counter petition on the desk with 14 names on it including his own at the top in large, deliberate handwriting, and he waited while the clerk read it through with the unhurried pace of a man who understood that unhurriedness was its own form of authority. 14 names, the clerk said. 14. Nathan confirmed. Dr. Mercer's petition has 7. I'm aware. The clerk looked at him over his glasses with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally very interested. Mr. Calloway, this is going to make things complicated. Things were already complicated, Nathan said pleasantly. Now they're complicated in both directions. Seems fair. He rode back to the ranch feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time, which was that he'd done the right thing, and it had cost him something real, and he didn't regret either part of that. He thought of Evelyn's face across the table from him the day before, not the careful face she wore in public, but the one underneath it, the one that showed when she thought she wasn't being watched too closely. The exhaustion in it, the stubborn life underneath the exhaustion. He thought about Margaret, which surprised him, because lately he'd been able to think about Margaret without it pulling him under. He'd loved her. He'd built everything with her in mind. When she died, the grief had done exactly what grief does to a man who doesn't know how to put it anywhere. It had calcified around the place she used to be and become something that looked from the outside a lot like armor. He didn't know what it looked like from the outside anymore. He wasn't sure he cared. That was its own kind of revelation. By Tuesday, Mercer had added 3 more names to his petition. By Tuesday afternoon, Nathan had added 2 more to the counter. The county clerk, who had never in 15 years of filing documents had what could reasonably be called a dramatic week, began keeping both petitions in a special folder on top of his desk where he could watch them. Wednesday morning the letter arrived. It came from the county seat, not the investigator Nathan had been warned about, but something else. A letter from the county medical board addressed to Dr. Silas Mercer, requesting a formal accounting of the complaint he'd filed and the grounds for it, and informing him that the counter petition had been received and logged, and that the matter would require a formal review before any action could be taken. Mercer read the letter alone in his office. Then he did something that nobody in Harlan Flats had ever seen him do. He made a mistake. He walked directly from his office to the general store where 4 or 5 people happened to be conducting their morning business, and he said in a voice pitched about 10 degrees louder than was necessary that Evelyn Harper was a danger to this community, that the people supporting her were being deceived by sentiment and gratitude and the very human tendency to credit luck as skill. And that when the county investigator arrived, and one would arrive, he was certain of it, they would all understand the difference between a healer and a fraud. He said the word fraud clearly enough that Mary Tilson, who was buying flour near the back of the store, wrote it down on the inside of her wrist with a pencil she happened to have in her apron. Mary Tilson had been buying dried chamomile from Evelyn Harper for 2 years for a stomach complaint that Mercer had diagnosed as temperament. Her stomach on chamomile was excellent. She went directly to Evelyn's cabin afterward. She knocked. Evelyn opened the door. Mary Tilson, who was not a dramatic woman, said, "He called you a fraud in front of half the town, out loud. I think you ought to know." She paused. "I'll sign whatever you need me to sign." Evelyn looked at the small, firm woman in her doorway and felt something shift inside her gratitude and grief, in the same instant, the particular grief of a person who has spent years being grateful for small mercies, because small mercies were what there was. "Come in," she said. "I'll put on coffee." Mary Tilson came in. She was the 15th signature. Evelyn sent word to Nathan through Billy that same afternoon. He came that evening later than she expected, in a mood that she read correctly as controlled anger looking for somewhere to go. He sat across from her table and looked at the petition with 15 names and then looked at her. "He called you a fraud," Nathan said. "In front of witnesses," Evelyn said. "Mary Tilson is reliable." "Mary Tilson is the most reliable person in this county," Evelyn said. "She's been keeping secrets for other people her whole life. She knows exactly what she saw and heard." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "That's slander," he said. "Out loud in public with witnesses. That's actionable." Evelyn looked at her hands. "I know what it is. I also know what it costs a woman to take legal action in a small town. I know what happens to the story when you do." She looked up. "I know because my mother tried it once, for something smaller. It went badly." Nathan looked at her with something she hadn't seen on his face before, the particular quality of attention a person gives when they are hearing something true and difficult and not looking away from it. "Tell me," he said quietly. She hesitated. Not because she didn't trust him, which surprised her when she realized it. She hesitated because she hadn't told it in a long time, and the shape of it still fit badly in the mouth. "My mother was a healer," she said. "My grandmother before her, in a small town in Missouri not so different from here. There was a doctor. There was a petition. When my mother tried to defend herself, formally signed papers, county office. All of it, they found reasons to discredit everything she presented. Her witnesses were dismissed. Her knowledge was called tradition, not science." She paused. "She lost the practice she'd built for 20 years. We moved. I was 11. She could feel him listening. Not just waiting for her to finish, actually listening. "I'm not my mother," she said. "And I know that. But I also know that the system has teeth that only bite in one direction, and I want us to be careful about which direction we're biting from." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "The petition isn't the whole play," he said slowly. "You're right that legal action has risks. But Mercer made a mistake today. Public. Witnessed. That's not a legal fight, that's a community fight. And community fights work differently." He leaned forward. "There are people in this town who benefit from you and know it. There are people who don't want to admit it out loud, and would if the alternative was watching you driven out." He paused. "There's a town meeting scheduled for the first Friday of August. County business, road repair, nothing dramatic. But it's a forum. Public. Anyone can speak." And Evelyn looked at him. "You want me to stand up in front of the whole town," she said. "I want you to let the town see you," he said. "Not defend yourself, see you. There's a difference." He held her gaze. "I'll stand up first. I'll say what I know, what I watched, what happened to Donovan. Ada Walsh will say what happened to Tom. Billy will say what he saw." He stopped. "And then you can speak or not speak as you choose. But they'll have seen where you stand." She looked at him for a long time. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Not accusatory, just straight. He didn't look away. "Because it's right," he said. "And because—" he stopped, started again. "Because I spent 5 years not letting anything matter, and I'm tired of it. And because you walked 3 miles in July heat for a horse that wasn't yours, and for a man who didn't say thank you. And whatever I am, I'm not someone who doesn't account for that." The room was very quiet. Evelyn felt the thing in her chest, that she had been refusing to name, move decisively in a direction she could not ignore. She looked down at the petition on the table. 15 names. "The town meeting is 3 weeks away," she said. "Yes," he said. "A lot can happen in 3 weeks." "Yes," he said again. He didn't pretend otherwise. That was one of the things about him. He did not smooth over the difficult parts to make her feel better, and she was finding to her own surprise that she trusted him more for it. "All right," she said. He nodded once, the way he always did when something was decided, without ceremony, without display, just a recognition that the decision was real. He stood to leave. He picked up his hat and then stood with it in his hands for a moment longer than strictly necessary, which she had come to understand was his version of saying something he hadn't found the words for yet. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said. She didn't know exactly what she was answering, but it felt right. He left. She sat alone in the lamplight with the petition in front of her and her mother's journal on the shelf above her head and the sound of his horse moving away down the road, and she thought about 11-year-old Evelyn watching her mother pack their life into 3 boxes and tell her it was going to be all right, and how she'd believed that because her mother had said it in the voice that meant she was frightened and intended to be all right anyway. Evelyn pressed her hand flat on the table. She was frightened. She intended to be all right anyway. That was Thursday. On Friday morning, she opened her door to find something on her step that had not been there the night before. It was a piece of paper folded once with no name on the outside. She picked it up. She unfolded it. Inside, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were 5 words. Leave before you make it worse, or you make it. She stood with it in her hand in the morning light and felt the cold move through her from the inside out. Not terror, she'd felt terror before, and this was the thing that came before it, the early quiet thing that was just reality pressing in. She refolded the paper. She put it in her apron pocket. She went inside. She took down her mother's journal from the shelf and opened it to the first page. Not for the plant information, not for the remedies, but for what her mother had written there. The only line on the page that wasn't about roots or leaves or tinctures. The ones who want you gone are always afraid of you. Remember that. She read it twice. Then she put on her boots, took her bag, and walked to Ada Walsh's farm. Ada opened the door and read Evelyn's face with the swift competence of a woman who had also been alive for a long time. "What happened?" she said. Evelyn showed her the note. Ada looked at it. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She looked up. "When?" "Sometime last night." Ada folded the note and handed it back with a deliberateness that said everything. "Does Nathan know?" "Not yet." "Tell him today," Ada said. It wasn't a suggestion. "I will," Evelyn said. "Come inside," Ada said. "Tom's been asking about you. He wants to say something to you himself." She paused, her hand on the doorframe. Men are bad at saying things until they mean them enough. Then sometimes they're very good at it. Evelyn went inside. Tom Walsh was at the table, his arm wrapped in clean cloth, eating breakfast with his left hand and looking sheepish about it. When Evelyn came in, he stood up too fast and winced for it and said, "Miss Harper, He stopped, tried again. "I wanted to say thank you. The real kind, not the, I'm sorry I waited to say it." Evelyn looked at this broad-shouldered man in his 40s, standing at a kitchen table struggling with gratitude, and she felt something very simple and very true. "Sit down, Tom," she said gently, "and eat your breakfast." He sat down. He ate his breakfast. She stayed for an hour. On the way back to her cabin in the full heat of the Friday morning, she thought about the note in her pocket. She thought about the town meeting in 3 weeks. She thought about Nathan standing first, saying what he knew, and Ada Walsh with her practical voice and her 15-year-old memories of herb jars and Tom's fever breaking at midnight. She thought about what Mercer was willing to do. And then she thought about something she hadn't let herself think about directly before, which was that the question was no longer simply whether she could stay in Harlan Flats. The question was whether Harlan Flats would be different after she did. She wanted it to be different. That wanting was new. Or not new, buried maybe. Under the years of keeping quiet and keeping on and asking for nothing more than to be left to do her work, she was done with that particular kind of smallness, she realized. She was going to the town meeting. She was going to stand up. She was going to speak. And whatever Silas Mercer had planned to do about it was going to have to get through 14 counter-petition signatures. Ada Walsh's flat, practical voice. Tom Walsh standing up on a healing arm, and Nathan Calloway with his hat in his hands and his name already on the paper. She walked the rest of the way home in the July heat, with her jaw set and her eyes forward, and her mother's voice in the back of her head saying the ones who want you gone are always afraid of you. She knocked on Nathan's door that afternoon with the note from her step. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at her with something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the calculation of a man working a problem. Something older and colder than that. "You're staying," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm staying," she said. He looked at the note one more time, then he folded it and put it in his pocket. "So am I," he said. The week before the town meeting, Harlan Flats held its breath. That was how it felt to Evelyn anyway. The ordinary rhythms of town life continued, the market, the post, the daily commerce of people who needed things and other people who had them. But underneath all of it ran something tighter and more watchful than usual. People looked at her differently on the street. Not all of them badly. Some of them with a quality she was still learning to receive, which was something like quiet solidarity. A nod held a beat too long. A hand briefly on her arm at the dry goods counter. A woman she barely knew, pressing a folded piece of paper into her hand outside the church that turned out to contain a name and a line that said, "I'll speak if you need me to." She added the name to her list. The list now had 19 names. Mercer's petition had 11. Nathan had told her that Tuesday morning, riding up to her cabin, before she'd finished her first coffee, which she was finding had become a pattern she had stopped pretending to be surprised by. He added 4 names overnight. Nathan said, standing in her doorway, with that particular coiled quality he carried lately like a man keeping something on a very short leash. 3 of them owe him money. The 4th is his nephew who moved here 6 months ago. His nephew, Evelyn said, arrived from St. Louis, doesn't know you from anyone. He paused. It's still fewer than 19. Numbers aren't everything, she said. No, he agreed. But there's something. She handed him a cup of coffee. He took it. They stood in her doorway in the early morning heat and drank it without making a particular ceremony of it. And Evelyn thought that this specific thing, this man standing at her door drinking her coffee before the day started, was something she had not had in her life for a long time and had stopped expecting to have again. She didn't say that. She drank her coffee. He's been talking to Judge Harlan, Nathan said after a moment. She looked at him sharply. About what? About the possibility of a formal injunction, barring you from practicing medicine pending the county review. He kept his voice level. It's not certain. Harlan's a reasonable man generally, but Mercer's been in his parlor 3 times this week. Evelyn set her cup down. If he gets an injunction before the town meeting, I know, Nathan said, then it doesn't matter what happens at the meeting. I'll already be barred and anything I say will look like self-interest. I know, he said again. He was looking at her steadily. I have an appointment with Judge Harlan this afternoon. She stared at him. Nathan. He and I have done business for 12 years, Nathan said. I'm not going to tell him how to rule. I'm going to make sure he has all the relevant information before he makes a decision. He paused. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. You're spending a great deal of yourself on this, she said quietly. Something moved across his face, not discomfort, but something more honest than that. Yes, he said simply. I am. He left for the judge's office at noon. He came back that evening with nothing resolved and everything still in play, which he reported with the flat, factual honesty that she had come to rely on as one of the most consistent things about him. Judge Harlan had listened. He had not committed. He had said he needed to consider the community interest from all angles, which Nathan translated with a grim accuracy as meaning Mercer had gotten there first and left an impression that was going to take time to counter. 2 days before the town meeting, Donovan came to her door. He came alone on foot with his arms still wrapped, but held easier now, moving with the cautious deliberateness of a man who had been genuinely frightened and not yet forgotten it. He took his hat off when she opened the door, and he held it the way Billy held his, twisted in both hands, which she was beginning to understand was a Callaway Ranch mannerism, this specific combination of anxiety and respect. Miss Harper, he said, I heard what Mercer's saying about you, what he's been saying. He stopped. His jaw worked. I want to be there Friday, at the meeting. I want to stand up and say what my arm looked like and what it looks like now. Evelyn looked at this man who had almost lost his arm to his own stubbornness, and a doctor who had written him off, and she felt the particular weight of a debt that couldn't be paid in money. You don't have to do that, she said. No, ma'am, he agreed. I know I don't. He met her eyes directly, the way working men did when they were being serious. That's why I'm doing it. She nodded once. Thank you, Donovan. He put his hat back on. Thank you, he said, and walked back the way he came. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, and thought about her mother's line in the journal, the ones who want you gone are always afraid of you, and thought that maybe the obverse of it was also true. that the ones who stayed were never there by accident. Thursday came in hard and hot the day before the meeting, and it brought with it the thing none of them had prepared for well enough. Evelyn was in her garden at 8:30 in the morning when she heard the sound from the road, not one horse but two, moving at the deliberate pace of official business. She stood up. She shaded her eyes. Two men she didn't recognize. Good horses, good clothes, the air of people who'd come from somewhere with more authority than Harlan Flats. They pulled up at her gate. "Miss Evelyn Harper," the first one said. "Yes," she said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I'm Deputy Surveyor Aldis from the county seat. We've received a formal complaint requesting an immediate review of unlicensed medical practice. This document is a notice of inquiry requiring you to appear before the county medical board within 30 days. He paused. "It's also a temporary advisory, not an injunction, not a legal bar, but a formal request that you refrain from treating patients pending review." Evelyn took the document. She opened it. She read it through once, completely the way her mother had taught her. Read everything, all of it, before you react to any of it. She looked up. "A request?" she said. "Not an order." "A formal advisory," the deputy repeated. "The distinction is—" "I know the distinction," she said. Her voice was steady. "Thank you." She went inside. She sat at the table with the document in front of her and her hands flat on the wood, and she breathed. In and out. The way her mother had taught her that too. When the worst thing happens, breathe first. You can fall apart after. Do it in order. She sent Billy for Nathan. Nathan arrived in 22 minutes, which meant he'd ridden hard, which meant Billy had conveyed the urgency correctly. He came through her door with his hat already off, and read the document standing up faster than she expected. She'd almost forgotten he was an educated man, that the ranch was a choice, not a constraint. He read it twice. "It's not an injunction," he said. "No," she said, "but it might as well be. If I treat anyone between now and the board review, and Mercer finds out, he'll use it to make the advisory into something harder," Nathan finished. "And if I don't treat anyone—" She stopped. She looked at the table. "There's a woman on the North Road who's 3 weeks from her time. She can't afford Mercer. She's been coming to me for 2 months. She paused. "There are others." Nathan put the document down. He looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he said. "Just that. Not what should we do. Not what's the smart move. What do you want to do?" She hadn't been asked that. Not directly. Not about this. "I want to keep doing my work," she said. "I want to help the people who come to me. I want to not let a man who doesn't know half of what I know tell me I'm dangerous for knowing it." She felt her voice want to break, and she held it. "But I don't want to hand him the weapon to finish this before we even get to say our piece tomorrow." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "The meeting is tomorrow," he said. "One day. Can the people who need you wait 1 day?" She thought. "The woman on the North Road is 3 weeks out." "Yes." She went through the others in her mind. "Most of them can wait a day. There's a child in town with a croup cough I've been managing. I'll send Ada Walsh to check on him tonight. Ada knows enough." "Then we wait 1 day," Nathan said. "We go to the meeting. We say what there is to say. And then, whatever the town decides, you'll have said your piece standing up in front of all of them, and that matters even when it doesn't win." She looked at him. "And if it doesn't win?" she said. He held her gaze. "Then we figure out what comes next. Together." The words sat in the air between them. She felt it. She didn't look away from it. "Together is a large word," she said. "I know it is," he said. "I said it on purpose." She was quiet for a moment that stretched and stretched. "All right," she said. That night someone broke her back garden gate. Not the plants, she thought afterward, that whoever it was had been afraid of doing the obvious thing, or maybe had enough conscience left to stop short of it. Just the gate, its iron hinge wrenched off the wood split where it met the post. She found it in the morning when she went out to the garden, before the sun got high, and she stood looking at it for a long moment. Then she went inside, got her tools, and fixed it herself. It took 40 minutes. She was good with tools. Thomas had shown her early in their marriage, partly because he was a practical man, and partly because he'd understood in the way some men understand, without being taught, that a woman alone needed to know how to fix the things that broke. She was tightening the last bolt when she heard boots on the path behind her. She turned. It was Nathan. He stopped when he saw the broken hinge replaced, saw her kneeling in the dirt with a wrench in her hand and the job already finished. Something moved across his face that she didn't try to name. "You fixed it," he said. "It needed fixing," she said. He came forward and crouched beside her and looked at the work, the clean seating of the new hinge, the proper tension on the bolt. He didn't say anything about the quality of it because there was nothing to say. It was done right. "I'm sorry this is happening," he said. She looked at him. "It's not your fault." "No," he said. "But I'm still sorry." He looked at her directly. "Some things you can be sorry for without being at fault. I've been learning that." She didn't ask what he meant. She thought she knew. She thought it had to do with Margaret and a spring 5 years ago, and a grief that had gone inward because there'd been nowhere else for it to go. She stood up. He stood with her. "Town meeting is in 4 hours, she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you ready?" She looked at her garden, her repaired gate, her hands with the wrench still in them. "I've been ready for 20 years, she said. "I just didn't have anyone to stand beside me." He looked at her with an expression that cracked something open in the sealed-off place behind his ribs, and he didn't hide it, which was the most Nathan Calloway thing he'd ever done. And she thought that if she lived to be 100, she'd remember the specific quality of his face at that exact moment. "You do now," he said. The Harlan Flats town meeting convened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the largest building in town, which was the feed warehouse, cleared of its usual contents, and set with chairs borrowed from the church. By 1:45, every chair was filled, and men were standing along the walls, 3 deep, which had never happened for a road repair agenda item in the history of the county. Evelyn sat in the 3rd row with Ada Walsh on her left and Billy Turner on her right. Donovan sat directly behind her. Mary Tilson and Tom Walsh were 4 seats over. 19 names on the counter petition, and most of them were in this room. Nathan sat in the front row alone, which was exactly where he should have been, and exactly where everyone could see him. Mercer arrived last, with deliberate timing, and took a seat near the front, on the opposite side, with 2 of the councilmen he'd been cultivating all month. He had his leather bag. He had his pressed vest. He looked at Evelyn once across the room, with a flat assessing quality, like a man taking the measure of a problem he was confident he'd already solved. She looked back. She did not look away. The meeting chairman, a rancher named Burl Hennessy, who'd run these meetings for 15 years and had the patience of a man who'd seen everything, opened the proceedings with the road repair business first. He got through it in 6 minutes, which was a record. Then he cleared his throat. "I understand there's additional business," he said, "regarding a matter that's been under community discussion. I'll hear from those who wish to speak. Dr. Mercer, as the initiating party, you're welcome to start." Mercer stood. He was good at this. She had to give him that. He was precise, reasonable-sounding credentialed. He spoke for 8 minutes about the importance of proper medical certification, about the risks of untrained practitioners, about community safety, and the county's legal frameworks. He mentioned no names. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. He sat down to a silence that wasn't quite approval, but wasn't quite rejection either. Then Nathan Calloway stood up. He didn't have notes. He stood with his hat in his hands and he looked at the room, not performing, not speechifying, just a man saying what he knew. "My stallion Storm was down with a colic 4 weeks ago," he said. "I had a rifle. I was 30 seconds from using it." Evelyn Harper walked 3 miles in July heat because a ranch hand asked her to, and she had Storm on his feet inside 20 minutes. He paused. 2 weeks ago, my hand Donovan had an infection in his arm that Dr. Mercer told me couldn't be treated. Mercer said, "Prepare for amputation at minimum." Evelyn Harper came to my ranch and spent 2 hours cleaning and treating that wound. Donovan is sitting behind me right now with both his arms. He looked at Mercer for exactly 1 second. "I don't know what to call that except skilled. And I know what I call a man who tells another man to prepare for amputation and then tries to bar the person who saved the arm from helping anyone else." He sat down. The room had a particular quality of silence that happens when something true and plainly spoken fills it. Ada Walsh stood up next. She said what Tom's fever had been and what it was now. Tom stood briefly, said nothing, and sat down, which was somehow more powerful than words. Mary Tilson stood and said what Mercer had called Evelyn in the general store in exactly those words in that voice. Donovan stood and held up his arm and said, "Both of them. Because of her." Then Burl Hennessy looked at Evelyn. She stood. The room looked at her. All of it. Every face, every opinion, every quiet ally and uncertain neighbor and person who'd bought something from her and not said so, and person who'd said nothing to Mercer and nothing to her, and was sitting right now in the balance of it. She did not rush. "My mother was a healer," she said. Her mother before her. "I learned what I know from women who knew how to keep people alive when there was nothing else available. I have never claimed to be a doctor. I have never tried to replace what a doctor does." She looked at Mercer briefly, and then away, because he wasn't who she was talking to. "I have tried to help the people who came to me when they had nowhere else to go. That's all I've ever done. That's all I'm asking to keep doing." She paused. "I know my knowledge isn't certified. I know it doesn't have a framed paper on a wall. But it works. And the people in this room who've watched it work deserve to keep choosing it." She sat down. Burl Hennessy let the quiet sit for a moment. Then he said, "Dr. Mercer, any response?" Mercer stood. He was still smooth, still practiced. But something in the room had shifted, and they both knew it. He made his case again, the legal framework, the county board, the importance of proper channels. And then he said, "This woman's activities and the inappropriate support of certain prominent members of this community constitute a pattern that frankly calls into question the judgment of—" "Sit down, Silas." The voice came from the back of the room. Everyone turned. It was Judge Harlan. He'd been standing against the back wall the entire time. Nobody had noticed him come in. He was 70 years old and had sat on the county bench for 30 of them, and when he spoke in that tone, rooms sat down. Mercer sat down. "I've heard enough," the judge said. He walked slowly to the front. "I've been doing some reading this week. Medical board statutes, county ordinances, the legal definition of practicing medicine." He looked at Evelyn. "What you do, Miss Harper, under the current county statute does not constitute the practice of medicine as legally defined. You're not prescribing. You're not diagnosing in the formal sense. You're providing traditional plant remedies which have been practiced in this state without legal prohibition for longer than the county's been a county." He paused. "Dr. Mercer's complaint on those grounds is without legal foundation. I'm noting that for the county record, and I'll be communicating as much to the medical board." He looked at Mercer. "The advisory notice will be withdrawn by end of business today." Silence. Then Ada Walsh said flatly and without drama, "Good." And the room breathed. Evelyn sat very still. She felt Ada's hand cover hers on her knee. She felt Billy Turner beside her, let out a breath so long it must have been held for a week. She looked at the front row where Nathan was turned around to look at her, and his face was doing the thing it had done in the barn, that 3 or 4 seconds of being open, unguarded real. She did not look away from it this time. Mercer gathered his bag and left the building before the meeting formally closed. He walked out into the July heat with his chin up and his vest pressed, and his face arranged into something that was supposed to communicate dignity, and communicated instead the particular expression of a man who has realized too late that he made his move 1 step ahead of his evidence. He would not file another petition. Not in Harlan Flats. He would stay because men like him always stayed, but the authority he'd built on other people's deference was smaller now, and they both knew it. Evelyn walked out of the feed warehouse into the afternoon light with Ada Walsh on one side and Donovan behind her, and Billy Turner already talking to someone about something the way Billy always was, and she stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk and let the heat come down on her, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the shape of it. It was being seen, properly, without apology. Nathan came out a minute later. He walked up to her and stopped close enough that the conversation was private, and he looked at her with that direct quality of his. "It's not over," she said quietly. "He'll find another angle." "Probably," Nathan said. "Judge Harlan won't always be in the back of the room." "No," Nathan agreed. "But today he was." She looked at him. "Today he was," she said. He nodded once. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He reached out and took her hand briefly, clearly in front of the people coming out of the building behind them. Just that. A hand taken and held for 3 seconds, and then released. It was not much. It was the most public thing either of them had done. She felt it in her chest, where she'd stopped letting herself feel things, and she did not push it back down. "Supper," he said. "My ranch. Tonight. Ada and Tom Billy Donovan. Everyone who stood up." He paused. "You too, obviously." "Obviously," she said, and she almost smiled. She was still holding herself carefully. She knew the ground they stood on. She knew Mercer was not finished, that the county board letter was still real, that the battle had shifted but not ended. She knew that Nathan Calloway was a man with a grief still working itself through him, and she was a woman who had learned not to build on uncertain ground. She knew all of that. She also knew that when he'd taken her hand, she had not wanted him to let go, and that she thought walking beside him through the heat of the late afternoon in Harlan Flats, Texas, was the beginning of something she did not yet have the right word for, but intended to find. The supper that night was the loudest the Calloway Ranch had been in 5 years. Nathan hadn't planned for loud. He'd told his cook, a quiet man named Hector, who'd been with the ranch since Margaret's time, and who expressed opinions exclusively through the quality of what he put on the table, that there would be 8 for supper, possibly 10, and to make enough. Hector had looked at him for a moment with the particular look of a man who understood context and had made enough for 15. It was needed. Ada Walsh arrived with Tom and a jar of preserved peaches she set on the table without ceremony. Billy Turner came with Donovan, who was in better spirits than anyone had seen him since before the wire incident, talking too much the way men do when they've been genuinely frightened and come out the other side. Mary Tilson brought her sister, who nobody had formally invited, but who turned out to know 3 of the ranch hands from church and fit into the evening without difficulty. 2 of the hands came themselves. The older one, thick-shouldered, who had said, "This is foolishness," in the barn 4 weeks ago, and a younger one called Pete, who'd signed the counter-petition on the second day, without being asked. Evelyn arrived last. She came to the door and knocked, which struck Nathan as something he needed to fix immediately, and he opened it and said without thinking about it, "You don't knock here." She looked at him. "All right," she said, and came in. He wasn't sure what either of them meant by that exchange, but it settled something. The table was full, and the food was good, and the conversation moved the way conversation does when people have been through something together. Not around it, but through it, the way you talk, after a storm has passed and you're still checking the edges of things to see what held. Billy recounted the afternoon's events to Donovan, who'd been in the back of the room and missed the judge's entrance with a dramatic flair that grew with each telling. Ada corrected him twice factually, which Billy accepted with good nature. Tom Walsh laughed at something for the first time in weeks and then looked surprised that he'd done it. Nathan sat at the head of the table and watched it, and felt something in his chest that had been locked up for so long he almost didn't recognize it when it moved. It was the feeling of a house being used the way a house was meant to be used. He looked at Evelyn, who was sitting 3 seats down, listening to something Ada was saying, with the focused quality she brought to everything, not polite, listening, but real listening, the kind where you actually change what you think because of what you hear. She felt his eyes and looked up briefly, and something passed between them that was too quick to catch and too clear to miss. He looked back at his plate. After supper, when the conversation had spread and softened, and Billy had wandered out to the barn to check on Storm for reasons that had more to do with sentiment than necessity, Evelyn found Nathan standing at the back of the house where the heat of the day was finally easing, and the stars were coming out over the Texas scrub. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight." "You don't thank me for supper," he said. "I thank you for the room full of people," she said, "for making them feel like that was the right place to be." She paused. "That was you. You did that." He was quiet for a moment. "Hector did most of it," he said. "Nathan?" "I know," he said. "I'm not good at receiving things." "I noticed," she said. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the sky. Her face turned up, and in the dark, she looked the way she always looked when she wasn't performing anything tired and real and more beautiful than he knew how to say, without making it sound smaller than it was. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said, before he could find the next word. "You can't know," he said. "I haven't said it." She looked at him then. "Say it then." He held her gaze. "I don't want you living 3 miles away," he said. "I don't want to be someone who rides to your door with problems and rides away when they're solved. I don't want to stand beside you in public and then act like we're strangers between times." He stopped. "I'm not good at speeches. I'm telling you plainly." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're telling me plainly," she said quietly, and there was something in her voice that was almost laughter, almost tears, the particular frequency those two things share when they happen at the same time. "Nathan Calloway, you wrote me a letter and rode to my door and put your name to mine in front of the county and took my hand in front of half the town. There was nothing plain about any of it." "I mean it plainly," he said, "whatever the form." She was quiet for a moment, that he let sit without filling it because he was learning that about her, that she thought through things all the way, and interrupting that was not something he was willing to do. "I've been alone for 2 years," she said finally. "And I'd made a kind of peace with that. The kind of peace where you tell yourself it's enough, and mostly believe it." She looked at him. "You've made it very difficult to keep believing it." "Good," he said. She almost smiled. "I'm not finished." He waited. "I'm not going to disappear into someone else's life," she said. "I did that once with Thomas, and I loved him, and it was right for what it was. But I was younger then, and I hadn't yet understood what it costs a woman to make herself small enough to fit into a shape that was already made before she got there." She looked at him steadily. "My work stays. My garden stays. My name stays. Whatever this is, whatever we're building toward it, has to have room in it for all of that." He looked at her for a moment. "Evelyn," he said, "I put my name on a public document to defend your right to keep doing your work. I'm not asking you to stop." "I know," she said. "I needed to say it out loud anyway." "Say whatever you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said quietly, "All right, Nathan." That was all. But the way she said it, the whole weight of it, the decision in it, was one of those moments that rearranges things that you know while it's happening will matter for a long time. He reached out and took her hand again. This time he didn't let go after 3 seconds. She let him hold it. They stood like that in the dark, until Billy came back from the barn and ruined it completely by calling out, "Storm's doing great. Miss Evelyn, I think he remembers you," in a voice that carried across the entire property. Nathan let go of her hand. Evelyn pressed her lips together against a smile. "He's not wrong," she said. "He never is," Nathan said. "It's one of his most irritating qualities." She laughed, actually laughed clear and unguarded, and Nathan thought it was the best thing he'd heard in 5 years, and didn't say so, and filed it away in the place where he kept things he intended to hold on to. 3 days later, the letter from the county medical board arrived. It was addressed to Evelyn Harper, formal and official, and it came on a Tuesday morning with the county seal on the envelope, and her name spelled correctly, which she noticed because Mercer had misspelled it on every document he'd filed. She sat at her table, and opened it and read it twice completely before she let herself react to it. The board had reviewed Dr. Mercer's original complaint and Judge Harlan's formal notation. They were requesting that she appear before them in the county seat on the 14th of August for an informal hearing, not a trial, not a prosecution, an inquiry. They wanted to understand what she did, how she did it, and what safeguards existed. They were, the letter said in careful bureaucratic language, open to the establishment of a formal category of traditional healing practice that would allow her work to continue within a defined legal framework. She read that last part 3 times. A formal category, a legal framework. She put the letter down and sat with it. Then she sent Billy for Nathan. He came. He read it. He looked up at her. "They're not shutting you down," he said. "No," she said. "They're asking me to come explain myself." "That's different." "Very different," she said. "It means Mercer's complaint actually did the opposite of what he intended. It pulled the board's attention to a gap in the legal framework they hadn't looked at directly." She looked at the letter again. "They're not saying I'm wrong. They're saying they don't have a category for what I am yet." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to go?" he said. "I want to go," she said, "but I want to go prepared. I want to walk in there with everything, my mother's journal documentation of every person I've treated, outcomes, methods. Everything." She paused. "I want to walk in there and give them so much evidence that the category they make has to be real. Not a polite dismissal. An actual legal standing." He looked at her with something she was beginning to be able to read clearly, which was pride, the quiet, uncomplicated kind. "I'll drive you to the county seat," he said. "Nathan, I'll drive you," he said simply. "You can argue with me about it on the road." She looked at him. "You're very difficult." "So I've been told," he said. She spent the next 8 days preparing. She sat at her table every evening and went through her mother's journal and her own records because she had kept records always in her own small, careful handwriting, dates and names, and presenting problems and what she'd given and what had happened after. 20 years of records. Names she hadn't thought about in years. Ailments, resolved fevers, broken children who'd grown up healthy. She organized it all into a coherent document with Nathan's help because he had the kind of mind that understood how formal presentations should be structured, and she had the kind of mind that understood what needed to be in them, and together they built something that was better than either of them could have built alone. Ada Walsh came over one evening with 3 other women who'd been Evelyn's patients and wanted to add their own written accounts. Mary Tilson brought a formal letter from her physician in Missouri, a real physician licensed and credentialed, who confirmed that the chamomile treatment Evelyn had recommended for Mary's stomach condition aligned with documented botanical medicine practices. Donovan wrote a statement in his careful, slightly crooked hand, the right hand deliberately describing in plain working man language what his arm had looked like and what it looked like now. He signed it with the kind of firm finality that said he'd thought about it and meant every word. By the day before they were due to leave for the county seat, Evelyn had a leather folder 2 inches thick. The night before they left, she sat alone in her cabin for a long time after the lamp was lit. She thought about her mother. She thought about Missouri and boxes packed and a woman who'd tried to fight through proper channels and had the channels close against her. She thought about being 11 years old and not understanding fully what was being lost, only that her mother's back was very straight as they left, and that had mattered had been its own instruction. She opened the journal to the first page. "The ones who want you gone are always afraid of you. Remember that." She read it. Then she turned to the last page her mother had written, on which she hadn't read in a long time, because the last entries were from the weeks before her mother died, and they had a quality of fragility that she'd never quite been ready for. Her mother's handwriting, older and more unsteady in those last pages, said, "Evelyn, if you find yourself in a room full of people with the authority to tell you no, make them tell you why. Don't let them be vague about it. Make them name it. The ones who are wrong can't name it clearly. The ones who might be persuaded can't look away from it. And the ones who are right, the rare ones, will be glad you made them say it out loud." Evelyn sat with that for a long time. Then she closed the journal, put it in the leather folder with everything else, and went to bed. She was ready. The road to the county seat took most of the morning. Nathan drove. She sat beside him with the folder on her lap, and they talked some and were quiet some, and it was the right balance of both. At one point he said, "Whatever happens in that room, you've already won the part that mattered most." She looked at him. "What part is that?" "The part where the town knows who you are," he said. "That doesn't go back in the box." She thought about it. "No," she said. "It doesn't." The county medical board met in a stone building in the county seat, cool and formal, and smelling of old paper and authority. 3 men at a long table, a physician, a county official, and a man from the state health board she hadn't expected. They were formal and careful and not unkind, which was better than she'd feared and less than she'd hoped. She sat down across from them. She put the folder on the table. She opened it. She talked for 40 minutes. She talked about her mother and her grandmother and the lineage of knowledge that had come down through them. She talked about the specific case's storm, which they hadn't expected, and which shifted something in the room when she explained it in detail, because the treatment she'd used was documented botanical practice going back 100 years. She talked about Donovan's arm and the infection and the drawing poultice, and she had Tom Walsh's written account and Donovan's statement and Ada's letter, and she placed each one on the table as she talked about it. She talked about Mary Tilson's stomach and the Missouri physician's letter. She talked about the fever cases and the croup and the women who'd come to her when they couldn't afford the doctor or had been dismissed by him. She talked about the gap in the legal framework that Mercer's complaint had accidentally illuminated, that there was no existing category for traditional botanical healing, not because it was illegal, but because no one had looked at it directly. She did not apologize for anything. She did not ask permission for anything. She made them name it. When she was done, the 3 men looked at the folder and at each other. The physician said, "Miss Harper, the documentation here is thorough." "Yes," she said. "You understand that a formal category of licensure would require defined standards, training requirements, perhaps an examination." "I understand that," she said. "I'd welcome that, provided the standards are built on actual botanical medicine knowledge and not simply on the requirements for a physician's license, which addresses a different discipline." The state man looked at her. "That's a reasonable distinction." The county official said, "It would take time to develop." "I have time," she said. "What I don't have is the ability to help people while I'm waiting for a framework that should have existed 20 years ago." The 3 men looked at each other again. The physician said, "We'll need 60 days to draft a formal proposal. In the interim, and I want to be clear, this is an interim measure, not a permanent ruling. The advisory notice is officially withdrawn, and you are permitted to continue your work pending the framework's establishment." Evelyn kept her face where it was. "Thank you," she said. "Thank your documentation," the state man said, and there was something almost like warmth in it. Very few people come before this board that prepared. She gathered her folder. She stood. She shook each hand because it was the right thing to do, and because her mother had taught her to shake the hand of anyone who'd dealt with her fairly regardless of how she felt about them. She walked out of that building into the August afternoon. Nathan was waiting at the wagon. He saw her face and stood up straighter. "Well," he said. 60 days, she said. "And my work continues." He looked at her for a moment. Then he let out a breath that she understood had been held since approximately the morning she'd found the broken gate. "Good," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "Good." She walked up to him and stopped close enough that the conversation belonged only to them, and she looked at him directly, the way she'd learned to look at things she intended to keep. "It's not over," she said. "The framework will have conditions. Mercer will keep making noise somewhere. The county will have opinions about what traditional medicine is allowed to be." "I know," he said. "This is the beginning of something long and difficult," she said. "Not the end of it." "Evelyn," he said, and his voice had that quality again, the one that cut through the space between people and said something true without dressing it up. "I've been building things for a long time. I know the difference between a beginning and an ending." He looked at her. "This is a beginning, and I'm not afraid of it." She looked at him. Then she did something she hadn't done first in a very long time. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, solid and certain the way he did most things. They stood like that for a moment in the August heat, two people who had both been alone for too long, and had found through the particular stubbornness of circumstances that they were better at holding ground together than apart. On the drive back to Harlan Flats, she told him about her mother's last journal entry. She read it to him from memory because she had it now all the way through. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was right. About the room full of people. About making them name it." "She usually was," Evelyn said. "She raised you," he said simply. "That makes sense." She looked at the road ahead, the August heat making the distance shimmer, the scrub on either side dry and patient and alive. 3 weeks later, the first herb bed appeared at the edge of the Callaway Ranch. Evelyn had not planned it. She'd come out one morning to check on a ranch hand with a persistent cough, and Nathan had walked her around the east side of the property to show her a patch of ground he'd had his hands clear and turn the soil, worked dark and ready, with a wooden border around it that someone had built with obvious care. She looked at it. "I don't know what goes in it," he said. "That's your department." She looked at him. "You built me a garden," she said. "I built you a start," he corrected. "The garden's yours." She stood with her hands in the turned soil for a long moment, feeling the heat of it, the particular living warmth of ground that was ready for something. She thought about her mother. She thought about Missouri. She thought about 11-year-old Evelyn watching boxes being carried out and believing her mother when she said it was going to be all right. It had been all right. Not easy, not straight, but all right. She thought about a black stallion standing up in a barn when nobody expected him to. She looked at Nathan standing beside his fence line in the August morning, watching her with that patient, direct quality of his, and she thought that the best things generally didn't arrive the way you expected them to. They arrived in July, heat trailing dust, asking for 20 minutes, and not waiting to be thanked. She stood up. "Yarrow first," she said. "It's the hardest to kill. Then lavender along the border. Then I'll need to bring starts from my cabin garden. The ginger root will take the longest to establish." "All right," he said. "It's going to take a full season to produce anything useful." "All right," he said again. She looked at him. "You're not in a hurry." "No," he said. "I'm not in a hurry." She nodded. She pressed her hands once more into the turned earth, committing the feeling of it to the place where she kept things she intended to hold on to. Storm ran the fence line that morning, the way he had every morning since the colic steady strong, the full power of an animal restored to himself. He passed them once, and then again, his dark coat catching the early light, and neither of them said anything about it. They didn't need to. Some things don't need saying. Some things simply are a woman with soil on her hands and a leather folder that changed the framework. A man who built a garden before he knew what went in it. A town that had finally seen both of them clearly and would not entirely forget. The herb bed would take a season. The rest of it had already taken root.